Recapping week 4. Shawn gets a Jared Goff victory lap in. We have a lot to talk about with the Lions. Lots to talk about with teams like the Falcons. That's what we'll be doing today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, as we were talking before the show, kind of just breaking down last week, it was a disappointing week, definitely, for the types of teams that we have. A lot of the receivers that we played had down weeks all at the same time. That'll happen. We know there's, some variance in receiver production, but, the down weeks will happen. But typically you're hoping that there's some spike weeks to offset it. It was disappointing to see a lot of them, the Garrett Wilsons and Devonta Smiths and guys that we have in a lot of leagues where we were really in on their prices and they've been performing well so far too and feeling really good about it. Starting them together in leagues and they both have down weeks was not ideal, certainly. But we were just joking about one of our teams where we have Saquon and J.K. Dobbins and T.J. Hawkinson. And it's like you get all these running back and tight end points and we still managed to lose because our receivers struggled and we had Mariota in the QB and
I just never would have guessed that we could lose. And this team was unbeaten going in, that we could lose our perfect record on a day where we have 2 touchdowns from J.K. Dobbins and a 40-point game from T.J. Hawkinson. But fantasy football is funny like that. And it is one of the reasons why we talk all the time about the huge weeks are the weeks that win you your week, they win you your league, they win you tournaments. But you can't mix those huge weeks in with a bunch of not just single-digit scores, but some low single-digit scores in there. The kind of funny part about that one and fun part about that one is that we actually have Gerald Everett and Pat Freiermuth in that league on the bench, and they would have been pretty good options. It's another team that looks great coming up for the bye weeks, but when you had some paths to win in week 4 and you didn't do it, you can't help but be a little disappointed.
Yeah. We're still fortunate to be 3-1. Have some good teams. Have some teams that have started really poorly. And, that'll happen. I'm sure some of the listeners do too. It's been an interesting start to the year. There are a ton of interesting storylines. My big intro for Stealing Signals this week was talking through this concept that we have talked about since pretty much the inception of Stealing Bananas about the haves and the have-nots. Last year, I think we did a whole show on the widening gap between the offenses that were interesting for fantasy football and the offenses that are not. And I think through the first month, that is the biggest storyline so far in fantasy football. I mentioned in my write-up in this introduction that it's one of those things that is like one of the first things that people do when they play fantasy football. When I talk to new players, they're like, so you want the players on the good teams, right? And it's like one of the first things that we think and as players or in the, the first weeks that you're playing or the first years that you're playing. And one of the things that you and I will talk about a lot is how you do want to target talent. You want to target individual players maybe and not consider the situation so much because the player can impact the team to a pretty huge degree. And that's been a way that we've played for years. And yet, so it kind of, I guess what I'm saying is it kind of depends which direction you're coming at it from, first of all. I think most of our listeners are coming at it from our direction. But there would be people that would listen and say, obviously, attack the good offenses, right? But what we're talking about is coming at it from this perspective of, focusing on talent and on individual player profiles and on who can be difference makers, and they can then impact their offenses and they can succeed despite subpar situations. Saquon Barkley is a great example of that. Somebody who, in my opinion, is probably the RB1 right now for the rest of the season. I know after week 1, Shawn, you wanted him in the top 3, and I was kind of pushing back. He's clearly in the top 3 at this point. I'd be curious if you'd agree with me, but I think you have to have him RB1 the rest of the season. He looks like the only running back that's hitting his 80th percentile preseason outcome. He's hit all the good things are happening for him. What we think of as his best case scenario is happening. And guys can succeed despite, less than ideal offensive situations when they're that good. And that's sort of the idea behind a lot of what we do. And yet, in the modern NFL, where we're at right now, there is such a wide gap between the teams that are willing to throw on early downs and be aggressive and make these, types of decisions that lead to them having success in real NFL games, but also lead to great fantasy scoring. We have to be pretty aware of what their situation is, because we are seeing, shout out Kyle Pitts, situations where players, despite not even, it's not, the Kyle Pitts thing is not a Kyle Pitts discussion. I wrote this week, his per route, targets per route run, and weighted targets per route run with the air yards are right on par with Mark Andrews. Now, Mark Andrews has been more efficient. Kyle Pitts has not. It's another thing I would expect to regress in Kyle Pitts' favor. But the big issue with Kyle Pitts right now is just his offense and the routes that he's running. He's just not playing. He's not getting out in enough passing routes, both because they're not throwing enough, and now they've cut his route percentage. It's very confusing. But that's a great example of this, have-not offense, where Arthur Smith's idea of how to win football games is to run the ball 14 straight times in the second half. And you can't really knock it because he did end up winning this game. But we have to learn to, maybe not learn to, but we have to react, right, to what we're seeing from these teams.
We do. And this week, I think, just so perfectly encapsulated both the highs and the lows of the way that we like to play, and then also how some of the approach of betting against the consensus is a little bit of a double-edged sword. One of the elements that we played pretty heavily this year was the New York Jets through 3 weeks with Joe Flacco at the helm. That was an offense that generated a huge number of expected points for fantasy. And then even with that being underperformed because the pie was so large, and pretty effective for a lot of the guys. Not everybody. Elijah Moore has been a disappointment. We joked a lot about playing Seattle New York Jets as this week 17 shootout that was going to carry the best ball teams to the victory. Yeah. I think that listeners know that that was both semi-serious and semi-joking. Obviously, the Jets and the Seahawks, if that's your main thing, you're probably going to have some trouble. But the Seahawks and Geno Smith in particular have perfectly hit on the scenario that we outlined that would, number one, make Geno a viable super flex quarterback. I mean, he's actually been a great just quarterback overall so far. I think if you're looking at what the whole season's probably going to look like, then you're still looking at super flex as being where he's the most viable, and super flex best ball probably. But because he's played well, I mean, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are playing well above what their ADPs would be. The Detroit Lions have been a lot of fun, and Jared Goff has been just a real revelation. And at least Goff has a lot of Kirk Cousins to him, maybe with a little bit more flair. And Cousins is really the guy that I think of when I think of Goff, in that they're going to have these passes that don't really make sense, aren't that accurate. And you think if you could just not throw those passes in, then you'd have an elite quarterback. But I mean, obviously, if you don't throw those passes in, then you have people like Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes. Not everybody can be that. I mean, you think about the game that Cousins had where he made a ton of very nice throws, but badly misses Justin Jefferson in the end zone, which would have given Jefferson, a 37, 38-point game. And every extra point, when you don't know how the rest of your lineup is going to do, I mean, you can get 30 points from Justin Jefferson and look back and still feel like, man, that was a missed opportunity to win. If Kirk Cousins just makes that pass, then I win my fantasy game. So there have been a lot of fun ones. And yet at the same time, if you have an offense that you've built some things around and the scenario that you would outline that would make that work doesn't play out, that part of it can be tough, right? And the most high profile element of it comes with Kyle Pitts, but it's also frustrating in that, Drake London looks like just an unmitigated superstar and someone who could have a Jefferson or Chase start to his career. Because those starts have been so unusual, big picture, we always try and make sure to say, don't expect someone to come out and be Justin Jefferson. Don't expect someone to come out and be Jamar Chase. But you're going to get some rookie seasons that really help you. Well, you watch a first month of Drake London, you're like, maybe he can go out there and be a Justin Jefferson. He looks that good. But now you're looking into week 5 and you feel like you probably can't even play him. And then the final sort of frustrating thing there is just the quarterback position. While it's not the first thing that people tend to look at in fantasy, and in many cases, the person who goes out there and drafts Josh Allen in their league, has to take a little bit of the scorn and criticism that comes with people saying, don't you know, and that's not really the QB window, and you've given up so much in terms of opportunity costs, and there are going to be some other QB plays that win. And how are you going to compete with the Lamar Jackson teams? How are you going to compete with the Jalen Hurts teams? How are you going to compete with whoever the late round breakout is in any given season? At the same time, if you take some of the risks at QB, which I like to do, but then you have the Trey Lance injury and you follow that up by Mariota being then your fun fallback play, and he has a game like this, suddenly you're 4 weeks in and you've taken 2 borderline zeros at the QB position. I mean, these teams are still loaded. QB is a position that you can continue to make some changes. You're not going to take a 0 at that spot the rest of the way. But to lose 2 games worth of quarterback production in the first month, that can't help but set you back. I mean, that's now a hurdle that you have to overcome and points you have to chase the entire rest of the season. So some very, very good things, some very, very bad things through the first month that really manifested in a huge way in week 4.
That QB thing is, I think, one of the, for people who've played for some time, one of the things that can go overlooked, which is because quarterbacks tend to have a decent floor. I mean, I know I don't spend. Basically, the way that I would put it is it's been incredibly frustrating because I don't think quarterbacks are really the huge difference-making point necessarily in fantasy. And I have some Lamar teams and some Hurts teams. Don't have any Josh Allen teams, but as you were saying, like if you took Josh Allen this year, you're in a great spot. I mean, he was a good pick. But last year was a year where, in hindsight, I looked back at some of my teams that didn't perform and had some really good players and was trying to figure out what happened. And I know I've talked about this a little bit on the show. And some of those teams, I had one where I did, we were kind of into Ryan Fitzpatrick as a bridge quarterback last year. And I had Fitzpatrick, I know, in week 1, and he got hurt right away, that hip injury, and ultimately never plays again. One of our favorites, kind of a bummer to see that he didn't get an opportunity last year to play one more year in Washington. It's kind of like the first team at the time that the team was his in several years, and he didn't even get to play one full week, and then he ended up retiring. But really low quarterback scoring, and then it was a bridge quarterback to Justin Fields, who I was really in on last year, and then I just decided to start Fields in week 2. He was already there, and I think I started Fields a few weeks in a row, and he had the really poor stretch at the beginning of his career last year. And a month or a month and a half into the season, I'm like, I have so few quarterback points that it's, and you don't realize how damaging that is, or at least I didn't until I kind of looked back and thought through it. And it's like the flip side of quarterbacks having solid floors, most quarterbacks, is that when you're getting these single digit quarterback points multiple weeks over the beginning of the year, you're losing on everyone because almost everyone is getting at least 10 or 15 quarterback points, even if they're starting bad quarterbacks. I mean, the main quarterback discussion tends to be, yeah, you're going to get 10 or 15 points, but how do you get 25 or 30 from the quarterback position? Is it worth targeting the guys that have the 25, 30 point weeks? It shouldn't be too hard to get 15 quarterback points. So when you are getting, Mariota this week had 3.86 quarterback points, I think it was. I know that because I saw it in a lot of my lineups, and it was very frustrating to see in every lineup this 3.86 points. To your point, the Lance stuff in the first couple of weeks and the Mariota behind it, those teams have scored so few quarterback points. And I look, obviously this means that I'm not very good at analyzing quarterbacks. I don't think that needs to be said, but I'm so frustrated that for the second year in a row, I have these teams that are off the tough starts because I can't just get a floor at the quarterback position. I'm hitting on a lot of other elements. Yeah, I mean, that's a frustrating element here. And again, we talk about these haves and have-nots, and we talk about, I wrote about it in the intro this week. I had some Mariota and Goff decisions. Sean, we had some in some leagues together. And my mindset was, well, number one, the projections liked Mariota more, even despite the projections tending to look at the Vegas lines and things, and the Lions having a little bit of a higher implied team total because their game had a higher over-under and all those things. Mariota still projected comfortably higher in most places. And for me, it's like I almost didn't even consider it because it's this idea of, oh, well, he has a rushing floor. Goff's weapons are out. He has better weapons, Mariota, at this point with London and Pitts as opposed to
two of the best weapons in the NFL, probably.
Yeah. I mean, it's fantastic. It looks on paper like, you just start Mariota in this spot. It's very easy. But what I wrote about was like when I looked back on the decisions I made this week and the things I maybe could have analyzed better, because I try to be fair. Like you talked about that team we have, Freiermuth and Everett on the bench, and I look back on that one, and if we had played 2 tight ends, we would have won. But we have really good receivers in that league, and there's really no scenario where we would have done that. But trying to be fair in the situation where I'm looking back at my decisions and trying to think of things I maybe should have done differently. This quarterback one was one that really stood out to me because I was on Mariota over Goff in multiple leagues. And what I probably should have considered was this haves or have-nots element where with Atlanta playing Cleveland at home, you have this potential for these two teams to be pretty run-heavy. They're both basically have-not offenses. If, you told me that one coach in the league was going to run 14 straight running back carries at some point, Arthur Smith would have been in the first handful or so that I would have guessed.
Well, it would have been one of the 2 teams from this game.
Right. These 2 teams, there's a couple others as I was thinking through that it could have been the Colts. It could have been, the 49ers, which are decent enough teams.
The Colts couldn't have done it because if they had done 14 consecutive runs, they wouldn't have had 14 total plays.
Yeah. But, the Patriots, there's teams that also could have been on this list, but the Falcons definitely are one of those teams. And that's maybe the best indication of a have-not. Is it like, well, does the coach have the potential to decide that they just need to establish the run for – and it was working to a degree. I mean, their 10-play drive where they ran the ball to a running back every play was a long touchdown drive. So, I mean,
in our Sunday night show, I just was sort of beside myself in terms of having gone through that. But the thing that I said, because again, it's important to be fair, is just that was a well-orchestrated drive. And although Arthur Smith does not seem like he's going to be a successful NFL head coach, he can design running plays. I just couldn't figure out where the Cleveland defense was on this because it's not like the Falcons used some misdirection. I mean, the Giants came out there and tried to balance running Saquon Barkley into the line over and over with all of these bootleg designs that got a couple of rushing touchdowns for Daniel Jones and allowed them to extend the drives. The Falcons are just like, we have a variety of pretty good run plays that we're going to run more or less right at you, and you are not going to be able to stop them. I mean, it looked like peak Priest Holmes. But if you're going to get those kinds of chunks in the running game, then where's the incentive to put it back on Marcus Mariota, who's struggling?
Yeah. And so, to be fair, we have to be fair. But then the flip side of that is it's still so extreme, right? 14 straight runs. And anyway, this idea of this Mariota Goff decision was one that I thought I could have maybe thought through differently. I could have thought through particularly the game environments and the potential for, even though Mariota has the rushing floor as we think about for quarterbacks, and that also the rushing ability creates more of a ceiling when the passing comes with it. It probably, and you're always at risk of being outcome biased because Goff had a 40-point game and Mariota scored 3 points. Like it can't be said without acknowledging that I'm maybe just being biased by the way these games played. But I think it probably could have been said that Goff's floor was probably safer because even if that game was slow, even if the Seahawks won that game in a way that the Seahawks kind of dictated the pace and went really slow like they like to sometimes, Goff and the Lions were still going to throw a lot. He was going to get a lot of pass attempts. He could have been really inefficient and he doesn't have any rushing and he could have had a bad game that way. But they're aggressive enough that probably he still gets to some type of passing yardage floor, even if he doesn't have touchdowns to go with it necessarily. And on Mariota's side, I don't know that this game against the Browns was one where he was really going to have any kind of, I don't know if he can have a 40-point game if they replay this 50 times, because how does this game blow up? Both teams are run-based teams. So just trying to think going forward through this idea of the haves and have-not offenses and how that can impact sort of if we're going to miss, how far we can miss in which direction, because I don't know. I'm kind of broken by the QB points thing, Sean. Like the total QB points on some of these rosters in single QB formats, And obviously the Trey Lance injury is just really unfortunate. Maybe I would have completely missed on that, or we, or as a community or whatever. I think he would have been mostly fine, frankly. He had a bad first game in terrible weather, and then he gets hurt right away in the second game. I don't think we really have a whole lot of a sample to make any kind of justification on saying that was a bad choice or there was something wrong with trusting in Lance there. But even going to Mariota and some of these other decisions, I don't know. Am I overreacting? Is this a process issue? Is it just bad luck? Because I'm pulling my hair out here with the QB points thing.
Yeah, and when I go through my leagues, the QB points are the main difference in the teams that are fantastic versus the teams that are poor. Now, the team that we have that's in first place and took that 3 from Mariota actually has gone through this entire drama where, it wasn't even just the week 2 and week 4, but getting basically 0 points from Lance in the rain game as well. That team's still doing well, and it illustrates why you want to build a powerhouse team and then try to build in a variety of scenarios at the quarterback position, because on some of the teams, even you'll be able to overcome what would be, this is basically the apocalypse scenario for these specific fantasy football teams in terms of how the overall scoring is played out. It's not just that you're not getting quarterback points, it's that it's such a high scoring position that it can't be one that you're consistently taking injuries or zeros or what have you. I think in terms of looking at Mariota versus Goff this last week, I think that one probably is a little bit more outcome. Well, one of the other things that we're looking at there is just, I don't know that we had enough information yet to say that this Seahawks-Lions game is going to shoot out. Now, we know that both defenses probably have some problems. We know that both quarterbacks have been better than expected going in. We know Geno Smith had been surprisingly good through 3 weeks. But, are you really expecting the Lions to get so completely and totally shredded by Geno Smith that they're in this passing script through the second half, and then without their weapons, they actually come through on it?
I wasn't expecting it. I took the under over at stealing lines. It was my one miss this week. I think both teams nearly hit the over on one of the teams. I think hit the over by themselves. The Seahawks with the win, and the lines were close. I will say I went 6-1-1 this week over at stealing lines. That was my one miss. It was a bad one. It was a very bad miss. But yeah, I took the under. I'm right there with you. I thought going in, the Lions were going to be inefficient offensively. The Seahawks were going to be the Seahawks, and this game wasn't going to be like this necessarily. So that's fair.
So really, the main thing I'm hearing there is 6-1-1. Make sure you get subscribed to Stealing Lines. Betting on sports, again, be reasonable, but pretty fun. The big picture, I think, is a little bit different for me. And I think the thing that I look back on this game and have some regret, or this week and have some regret, is the situation with Mariota, and he had played fairly well. And I just had so much enthusiasm for that. But you have to, again, because it's such a high-scoring position, you have to take some steps to ensure points. And I think, and one of the issues that I have going forward with playing Carson Wentz, who's had 2 good weeks and 2 bad weeks and has weapons and has a team that's going to trail and there's going to be garbage time. But then also with Mariota now, the situation with the Falcons is they're now 2-2, and they're going up against this brutal schedule. We've kind of talked for a minute or two before the show that maybe the only silver lining, and this is a bad silver lining, because you don't want the silver lining to be that your team is going to face a bunch of great defenses. That's a bad silver lining, because facing great defense. Think about what happened to the Rams on Monday Night Football. They were just swarmed under by the 49ers. That was about as roughshod as you'll ever see someone run over by an opposing defense. And you're talking about the defending Super Bowl champions. So the Falcons are going to face enough defensive threat over the next month. It's probably not a good time to go to Desmond Ridder, but you know that he's lurking in the background. You know that if Mariota has another stretch where he throws a bunch of incomplete passes and throws a pick, this was a soft benching for him in this game. And we now also have the threat of a real benching going forward. I don't know what the situation is with Washington. Sam Howell wasn't active last week, so they couldn't have put him in at the end to get a little bit of a look at him. And Washington seems to have, you just need to change the narrative. You can tell with the way the commentators are raving about a quarterback. One of the things here, Jahan Dotson runs a beautiful route, makes a nice catch in the corner of the end zone. They throw up the next gen stats showing that it's like a 28% catch probability type of play. So a nice route, a good catch, a good pass. Basically, Carson Wentz was catastrophically awful the entire rest of the game and has given Washington no chance to win. But instead of crafting a narrative where the Washington Commanders had this amazing offseason where they managed to get Wentz for cheap and also get their future starting quarterback in the 5th round, they continue to work through the media to try and make it look like the Wentz portion of it was a win, which that backs them into the corner in terms of them being able to move to the part of it that actually was a win. But I think that when we're looking at quarterbacks to potentially play going forward, the benching issue is a problem. And then the other thing, just, with Justin Fields as well, is that, Chicago gave a lot of indication that their offense was going to be like this. And one of the things that I really like to do is to bet against some of the narratives that could easily go the opposite way. And if they go the opposite way, would be a big win. And especially if you can kind of stack those. So if you're in a situation where you're betting on Lance and Fields and Mariota, all three of them with hybrid upside, for all three of them to miss, I like putting that together. But then you get the injury, and then you get the situation with the Bears where people were right about the Bears. And so unlike the situation, and one of the things, kind of mentioning, where are some of these narratives that obviously the analysis didn't support? Well, this idea that Allen Robinson was going to have a bounce back campaign and be worth a pick in that range, the analysis didn't support that. It definitely didn't happen. Running routes against air in practice didn't make any difference. The unfortunate thing kind of is that what this did is it turned Tyler Higbee into an impact tight end, which that if you're not on Tyler Higbee, that's actually a bigger problem than not being on. Or, if Allen Robinson had hit, it probably would have had less of an impact actually than Tyler Higbee hitting. And so from that perspective, it's almost bad to have been right about Allen Robinson if you're not also on Higbee. But one of the things here, you watch the Bears, and this just, again, another very similar situation to the Falcons game where they're just not really giving their player a chance. The Bears game is not one of the games that I tend to watch during the day on Sunday. I watch the games that are fun.
Yeah.
So every week on Monday and Tuesday, I'm watching like the Texans and the Bears and maybe the Giants, even though with so much Saquon Barkley, I do like to see how he's doing. But you watch the bottom line and you watch the stats pop up throughout the day and you're thinking, well, Justin Fields is having another terrible game. And then you go and watch it and he's escaping the rush. He's showing off unbelievable athletic ability, sprinting down the field. The pass that he completed on the long game to Darnell Mooney is maybe the best pass of the entire weekend. The incompletions and the bad line are coming from all of these tricky down and distance situations where he's trying to move a team that has Equanimous St. Brown and Dante Pettis as the number 2 and number 3 wide receivers. Well, he's got no chance.
Yeah.
And so that part for him too, again, that's not playing out. Now, the part that it's important to admit is that those things were not kept secret from us.
Yeah.
We knew those things going in.
But like you said, if Lance, Fields, Mariota, if you make all those bets or you make 2 of them in some leagues, you're expecting not necessarily to be right, but you're expecting at least one of them to pan out. And sort of part of the idea was with them all having the dual ability, as you and I talk through it, I think maybe if I can explain sort of your thoughts on it, I really bought into the Mariota thing. I was concerned about the Fields thing just because of snake bitten from last year. Everything you're saying right now feels like one of my rants from last year for the listeners who listened to the in-season stuff last year, where every week I was going on and on about how Fields was getting judged unfairly because he had absolutely no help from the scheme, from his players around him, from his offensive line. It was terrible. But the idea of, those 3 rushing quarterbacks is that one of them could end up being a really big hit that helps define the season in a way that those guys could potentially be, first of all, top 10 quarterbacks pretty easily when they hit some type of a passing ceiling along with their dual threat ability. But potentially top 5 guys. And you want to be looking for guys that can be difference makers. And especially when you're building a portfolio of teams and those types of things. I just did, the really quick math. But if you said even it was a 25% probability for all 3 of those guys to have a really positive outcome, so 75% likelihood that it wasn't going to happen, for all 3 of them to miss is like a 40% outcome. You're like 60-40 to the positive that at least one of them would have a positive outcome. I mean, just saying 75 probability times 75% times 75%. And that's, I think low probably, especially for like Lance. Lance was not a 25% probability to have a really good outcome. It is a little crazy that all those guys have missed in this way. The Fields thing is really interesting in the context of what I was talking about with Mariota, where I was thinking about him as I was writing about it, because I think I've already made that adjustment with Fields, where it's like, yeah, he has a rushing ability, but this team is so bad, and the way that they play their offense is so bad, and they kill games in such a way that you can't start Fields. Like, it's just a problem for fantasy right now. And
one of the things that we've had is that through the first 4 weeks, their game scripts have been a little bit unusual, and they were more in the game than they probably should have been. And going forward, they will not be. There will be more garbage time, and they have the choice to either be completely uncompetitive or.
But they did that in the Packers games. One of the things I wrote about in stealing signals after the Packers game, when they were trailing significantly, was that they still went massively to the run in pass rate over expected, in a way that also brought the Packers massively to the run. What I wrote this week, the Bears this week were negative 10% pass rate over expected. The Giants were negative 21%. Now, part of that is they had a lot of receiver issues. They didn't have Tony and Wan'Dale Robinson back. They wanted to go run. But when a team that you're playing and you're beating is going as run heavy as the Bears were, the Giants in the leading scenario are also very comfortable running the ball and shortening the game, which is what happened with the Packers and Bears game. Bears opponents have averaged a 47% pass rate this year, which is like egregiously low. It's lower than any individual team. Bears opponents is the run heaviest team in the league so far this year. If you think of them as a group, none of them has hit 60%, which is like close to league average. None of them has even exceeded 58%. So yeah, you get the Giants going even more run heavy than the Bears in this game relative to their game script, even though they were leading. Because when the Bears are trailing, they're still running the ball so much. Again, it's the same thing I saw with the Packers numbers. The Bears were even more run heavy in that game than the Packers relative to expectation. But they were running while trailing, and they ended up scoring and kind of making it a 1-score game late. But the issue with that, and also sort of the issue with the Arthur Smith thing from a game theory, trying to win NFL games perspective, the Bears put themselves in a situation where they shortened the game when they were down multiple scores. And I know they had one really long scoring drive in that Packers game where I believe they cut it to 1 score, but they took up like 8 minutes, and they left it so that there was maybe 2 possessions left in the whole game. Packers then got into like field goal range and kicked the field goal, pushed it back to 2 scores. That was the end margin. Like, the only way that works is then because you're shortening the game so much and limiting the possessions on both sides, is if you then prevent the other team from scoring any more points and are able to continue to run and score. And the other issue is, can you even run and score? The Falcons did it in this game. We see a lot of other teams doing it, having to settle for.
Well, you have a game where Khalil Herbert has all of these breakaway plays, and I mean, he's very, very good. And you still kick 4 field goals in the direction of, well, I'm thinking in terms of the previous week, right? Where I mean, he makes them feel like we can run and be successful. My point is that, number one, I mean, Fields was not a play for week 4. He was not in lineups for week 4, and he was not the starting play for the teams either. He's a backup to Trey Lance, or he's in this mix with Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, kind of being drafted as maybe the upside play along with a more conservative quarterback. But you think about from the full season perspective, you're betting against a team having that as their mentality. And I guess my point is that what you're saying is exactly right. That's what they've done, and it's possible that they will continue to do that. We've seen teams continue to do it. I think that as their record collapses and some of these margins get bigger, they're going to be forced to at least consider if they want to be that type of team, or do they want to be a team that's more similar to the Detroit Lions. When you think about, even from the perspective of positive press and how it works with the fans, I mean, think about the Lions and how bad they were from a record perspective last year, and how much optimism and enthusiasm there was for the team and for Dan Campbell because of the way they played. Are the Bears going to go the exact opposite direction when you have an exciting young player like Justin Fields? I mean, maybe they will. But I think that even now, it makes some sense to bet against that in ways that are inexpensive. And that's the other thing about the Justin Fields bet. It's just that it was an inexpensive bet. It becomes a much higher leverage bet, however, when the Trey Lance portion of the bet gets wiped out early in the season.
Yeah, definitely. And I lied. I have to correct myself. The Bears opponents are not the run heaviest team in the league because the Bears themselves are. They're at a 45% pass rate. Bears opponents 47% pass rate. They'd be the second run heaviest team in the league. But yeah, Bears games suck. Just bad football right now. It is possible for things to shift, right? But unfortunately, and it could be said, and maybe with the Packers point, I was just describing that game, limiting the possessions and everything, it could be said that the Bears are such an inferior team that they actually played that somewhat optimally and tried to get it down to a one possession game where they were within one good outcome away, like the Packers having a key drop or something that leads, a deflection leads to an interception or something. It's how they beat the Texans, frankly. They run the clock so much, and then Davis Mills throws an interception late, and they're able to just settle for a field goal. But they're basically saying we can't actually compete with any team, even the Texans, and we're going to just try to run the game out to such a degree. And actually, I have the Packers thing all wrong because their long drive was they didn't score. I'm sorry. They had a long drive, and then they got stoned at the 1 yard line on 4th and goal. They would have cut it to 7 points. Even if they would have scored there, they would have then needed to hold the Packers and score again. Anyway, they ended up losing by 17 points. But I do think there's something to be said for these bad teams about trying to limit the possessions because they are underdogs or they don't have faith in their offense to win in a game that's a real football game that has more possessions.
I think that makes more sense early in the season when you have a decent record and there's a chance that the entire season could fall in a weird way that you're competitive. I mean, you don't want to give games up while you're still they weren't that far from going 3-1. I mean, you mentioned the field goals, and that was a big part of this game. The Bears actually moved the ball better than the stats would indicate. If you just look at the box score, you're thinking, I mean, this was gross. They had some chances. I mean, where they needed to execute was in the red zone. I mean, all of those field goals, they were scoring in terms of the number of possessions that they scored on, as well as the Giants. But the Giants got those rushing touchdowns from Daniel Jones on beautifully designed plays. I mean, you're going to have to get some of that from the Bears. And in their defense, I mean, Justin Fields made some rushing plays that were similar. They just weren't down there by the goal line. They didn't get the touchdowns. But
this is one of the things, the field goal thing. I mean, I don't have any great data on this, but if you think through about it, think through it logically, this is one of the issues with being so run heavy because teams are, especially in the modern NFL, we talked about how we hadn't seen the rushing efficiency back this up, but teams are sitting back in more cover 2 shells, and they're trying to make teams beat them with long, slow, methodical drives. And so that should open up the rushing. And we've talked last week, Sean, you were pointing out, it's weird that the running games haven't been better as a result of this. We did see a little bit more efficient running, I think, this week as a whole across the NFL. But when teams are doing that, that helps you between the 20s. But once you get inside the 20, and maybe not at the goal line, I know there's data that shows that like at the goal line inside the 5, running is more effective than trying to throw in that tight of an area. But say between the 20 and the 10, trying to get then that extra first down that gets you into the and goal situation, or even between the 20 and up to the 5, the further back red zone areas, you need to be able to throw the ball when the secondary can now start to creep up some because there's not 50 yards of field behind them anymore where they can get beat over the top. Now, all of a sudden, the field does shrink. You're getting guys playing downhill more in the second layer of the defense, and it becomes tougher to run in a smaller field because, again, the safeties and stuff, they're not worried about a go route on the outside from the 15-yard line necessarily. Like you could throw a corner fade, but they're not worried about a guy just running away from the cornerback and him not being able to catch up because the back end of the end zone is the deep safety at that point, right? So you start to get into this position where then now you have to learn. You have to switch it on. You have to switch your passing offense on. You have to be able to throw because the running game might get a little less efficient in those ranges. And a lot of times these teams just end up settling for field goals because they can't keep running as effectively as they were from their own 40-yard line when the opposing defense is sort of letting them run. It's a bend, don't break philosophy, which the running game is going to play right into. And there's also the element that it's harder to hit on the big plays running the ball as well. So if you are mixing in throws, if you're not doing the Arthur Smith thing and running the ball 14 straight times, sometimes those throws are going to create big plays. It's sort of you're taking your opportunities, or you're maximizing your opportunities for the big plays in the passing game. You're maximizing your opportunities for a blown coverage or whatever it is. Somebody breaks a tackle. The Deebo Samuel play on Monday Night Football, he makes a great play in traffic, breaks a couple tackles. Not everybody has a Deebo Samuel caliber player on their team, but that type of play, it can happen in the running game, but it's more common in the passing game. And so the whole idea is like, you're not giving yourself the opportunity for the long touchdowns throughout the whole field. And as you get closer into the smaller area of the field, you have to then suddenly either run more effectively against a tougher defense to run against that no longer has to defend downfield, or turn your passing game on right in the moment that you need it, right? And that's where it gets challenging. I mean, some of these goal line plays, you see these teams actually try to use Justin Fields and roll him out and throw, and it's like, this dude's been asked to drop back like 10 times all game. He's not going to just suddenly pull something. He's not going to make a Patrick Mahomes play right now, where Mahomes stretches to the sideline, spins off a guy, extends a play, and hits a. I mean, how do you expect him to make that play at that point after you've run the ball all the way down the field? There's no rhythm to the offense.
Well, you need more opportunities to do it. The whole thing that we talk about every other week is just that the more chances you give your quarterback to make throws. I mean, think about times when Josh Allen is stopped. It's like, go back and look at what they did at first down. It was a Zach Moss run. Then it made it trickier for him to keep the offense going. Those Zach Moss first down runs are really cracking me up at this point. So we look at that, and I think that there are a lot of things that are interesting going on at the QB position. The flip side of it, the other player that we really liked, Jalen Hurts, that's another one where you're at least mildly betting against the community in general. And this idea that the Eagles are going to be very run heavy, that one has played out extremely well. So our Jalen Hurts teams look fantastic. I mean, Jalen Hurts, the teams that you have him on, those now look like tournament winning teams, not just league winning teams. And so you don't get the guy hurt. You have this mild element where things have moved in the direction that you thought it might. We talked about last week how betting against the run heavy teams, or the idea that these teams were going to have hybrid quarterbacks and the passing volume wouldn't be there, that was very effective through 3 weeks. There were some issues that we ran into, obviously, in week 4. And the biggest thing about week 4 is just there were so many fun players in the 2 rain games, and the vast majority of them got wiped out. And then A.J. Brown loses his touchdown on really questionable offensive pass interference. And so you lose the 4 games in those the 4 teams in those 2 games, and you lose a big chunk of the weekend. I know that there's a lot going on, and obviously this is just purely fanciful, but wouldn't you love to have all 16 games every week in a dome and see these teams get to do what they can actually do?
That A.J. Brown TD getting wiped out, by the way, I went back and watched that on all 22 because I had to see, because I saw some people say that was a good call. Goddard was looking back at Hurts. It was a little RPO. He doesn't release the wide receiver screen right away, but he's kind of rolling like he might run, and he ends up throwing it outside to Brown. Goddard's downfield, but he's not blocking, and he's literally watching Hurts until he releases. And the DB puts his hands on Goddard first, and then Goddard puts his hands up like right as Hurts is in his motion. It was a bad flag. If you go back and watch it, for anyone who might care, they called Goddard for blocking downfield before the ball was released, which is offensive pass interference. He had gone downfield and was just standing in front of the DB. As you know, the play design was Hurts could either run or throw out to A.J. Brown, and he ended up throwing out to A.J. Brown. I thought it was a really, really ticky-tack call on a watch back, which was a bummer. But yeah, the Eagles, super fun team, like you said. I mean, this is a great example of the opposite of what we're talking about, which is we were saying this offseason, they had a possibility of being like this year's Bills, sort of like that they would be this team that the year, a couple years ago, the year that the Bills got Diggs and suddenly became a really pass first team, and Josh Allen, everything blew up. It's kind of hard to think back to, what was that, 2020, and what the preseason expectations were. There was a lot of optimism for the Bills, but they weren't as aggressive on a pass rate over expected level than they were immediately, basically starting that year. It was a philosophical change pretty clearly. They were going to be a pass first team, and it worked incredibly well, obviously, and they still do it. They're one of the 2 teams with the Chiefs that are consistently every week above average in pass rate over expected. some of that is they have the talent and they have the players in place and they have the quarterbacks in place, but some of it is just good coaching, because that's, I think, part of the reason these teams are so much better than every other team, is that they're willing to do that. We've seen that with the Eagles. They went very run heavy in this. There was some weather. I'm not that concerned about this one game where they went very run heavy. It was kind of expected. We talked a little bit about that as a risk going in.
If your opponent can't stop Miles Sanders in your head, then
might as well keep running.
Wait till week 5.
Yeah. The cool thing with Hurts is he's also getting so many carries. I mean, in a game where they go this run heavy, they run 50 times. He gets 16 carries. He didn't actually have a very big rushing line. He did get a TD in there. Miles Sanders got 27 of his own. Boston Scott was out, your boy Boston Scott. So Miles Sanders got to consolidate some of that backfield work. But yeah, to wrap up some of the Atlanta and Bears stuff, one of the points you made, I think is super accurate, is just this idea that we're early in the season. It's a little bit frustrating from a fantasy perspective that they both started 2-2 because you get that feedback loop where they're probably going to keep doing this for a few weeks. But your point, and I don't want it to get missed, was that if they're 3-7 at some point, we're probably going to see a little bit of a shift, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons too that we do encourage listeners to lean into what their own strengths are and what their own comfort levels with different elements are. This has been really frustrating over the first month, but it's not necessarily something that I would do a lot differently, because I do think that over time it creates super teams and it creates a lot of total upside, and it creates exposure again to league winning outcomes and tournament winning outcomes. And even now going forward, we still have a path to come back from this, because there are QB situations out there that will work. You have players like a Jared Goff, who's somebody that we also have a lot of exposure to, even though it kind of feels silly when you're doing it because it's Jared Goff. There are guys like Kenny Pickett. I mean, that's the other thing that, was just weird and sort of frustrating about this week, is that we had him stashed in a lot of places after going into the Thursday night game a week ago. And it seemed like they could make the move. They make the move at an odd time, in that, I mean, you've got a week and a half to prepare and you still want to give Mitchell Trubisky one more half. That part
makes no sense. And clearly saying we're not making a quarterback change. Because when I was first talking about Pickett going before the Thursday night game and stealing signals, I said I thought there was a better than 50% chance that Pickett would start in this Jets game. But I in writing it up, I mentioned there was a possibility he could be an in-game change there if Trubisky's not getting the offense going against the Jets. I mean, that's an obvious spot to be like, well, we have to inject some life into our offense. But I still wanted to cut him last week because they were so clear that they weren't going to make a change immediately after the game and through the 10-day break. It made no sense, and it's super frustrating because now Pickett's out there, available in a lot of leagues. He's a nice pickup, I think. This is a team that can't run the ball, has weapons. Pickett had a better yards per attempt in this game. He was at like 9.2 than anywhere. Trubisky's gotten nowhere close. I was debating with somebody, a co-manager, about on a league where we have Zach Wilson stashed. Zach Wilson has never had a single game in his career with a yards per attempt even close to that. He has 1 over 8 yards per attempt. Pickett again was at like 9.2. I think Zach Wilson's career high is 8.4. All of his other career games sub 8 yards per attempt. Pickett actually got the ball downfield a little bit. He ends up throwing 3 picks, none of them really on him. Goes 10 for 13. The picks count as incompletions. All of his other 10 passes were complete in this game. One of his picks is certainly not on him. Was a really nice Hail Mary that he threw.
Where are your guys? Get down there and make a play on the ball.
No, they got to make a play on that. It was a great pass. And then he had like an 80% completion percentage this preseason. Like, I was not on Kenny Pickett. We weren't, Sean, we've talked a lot about the rookie quarterback class. Not a guy that we were on in a lot of spots. I think he's going to play well in this offense. He's got good weapons. And again, they can't run the ball. Like, I think it's all going to play out well for him in fantasy. He's mobile. He gets, pretty fluky 2 rushing TDs here. I know at least one was a sneak. Were they both sneaks?
Was it as fluky as Zach Wilson's receiving touchdown?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I'm taking Pickett over Zach Wilson pretty clearly. I think for people that are in shallower single QB leagues, still trying to find answers at QB, maybe they lost Lance. Pickett is a guy. I mean, it's tough to go play him this week against the Bills, but
he's a guy upcoming schedule.
Yeah, it's really tough.
So that balances it out when you think about how you want to bid on him and what your short-term outlook is. But what you mentioned there, and you can look at the numbers, you can just watch the game. The stark contrast between Zach Wilson on one side and Kenny Pickett on the other. I mean, you've got a guy who immediately looks like an NFL starting quarterback and a guy who looks like is going to be someone maybe he can hang on and be Geno Smith in 10 years. But you have one player on one side who immediately unlocks all of the receivers. Well, probably not Chase Claypool. And on the other side, you have a guy who immediately appears to lock them down. Now, partly that's maybe the fact that Corey Davis is not the guy we're rooting for in that offense. They had a little bit of a rapport in the game. And I thought that, this is Zach Wilson's first game of 2022. He's coming off of an injury. And anytime that you're not 100%, and if you haven't been playing, it's hard to be 100% physically and mentally. And you're not just playing a sport, but you're doing it at the very highest level. I think that's hard. And so I do think that sometimes my personal expectations for Zach Wilson are unfair. But you see him surrounded with guys like he has, and you watch what Kenny Pickett is doing surrounded by those players, and it's a contrast that you can't ignore. One player looks good and the other one does not. I'm excited for the Steelers. It's one of the reasons too why I guess I wasn't surprised that they made the move. It's one of the reasons why I think we could see a move on some of these other teams that come out of nowhere, because it's just hard to make everything line up and everything be logical. I think if we're expecting teams to make moves to the quarterback at a point in time where that guy is going to get maybe a softer schedule or have had a better week of practice, all of these types of things. The coach is going to make the emotional decision that humans make, and it's going to feel like this is the time we've got to make the move. You're going to see Desmond Ridder. Maybe you won't see Sam Howell. Maybe you'll see Taylor Heineke. I don't know what's going to go on there in Washington. Theirs is so weird, but exciting to see Pickett in. The big other story in this game was just that there was a big switch from weeks 1 and 2 to weeks 3 and 4 in terms of George Pickens. With how quickly Drake London and Garrett Wilson broke out, it looked like Pickens was going to be a relatively bad pick at his ADP compared to some of those guys. Now he looks like he could challenge Deontay Johnson. We've got a decent amount of Deontay Johnson. I guess I'm not that worried about that. I think both of those guys and Freiermuth can survive in that offense as long as they don't try and run the ball just because they've got a rookie quarterback, and as long as Chase Claypool really does go to almost zero, which is where it kind of looks like. He was responsible for one of the interceptions in as much as he didn't win a jump ball, which as the receiver, you've got to kind of do.
He just wasn't even competitive on it. He just did like a fadeaway jump at the catch point and got it tipped away. And then the tip goes straight to a defender who wasn't, a factor at the catch point. It wasn't a great throw, but I wrote that up as being, somewhat bad luck, the interception, but also somewhat on Claypool too.
When you are only getting a handful of chances and then you create an interception, it doesn't leave a good taste in the quarterback's mouth. I think the offense is going to be fun. The Jets, this is another situation similar to the Kyle Pitts deal where, when you're down in the red zone and you're trying to figure out where Garrett Wilson's lined up and the answer is that he's standing on the sideline, there's some things on the coaches too. You can't have him not out there on crucial plays unless for some reason he's limited. He looked healthy. He does have a bad drop in this game. It wouldn't have been a big fantasy producing type of play, but when you're going to a lower volume situation, when the game plan has changed to feature more Breece Hall running the ball, which in many ways that could be very exciting. And Breece Hall looks like, he's a matter of weeks away, especially with all the issues that Jonathan Taylor is having. It sounds like he's been announced out for Thursday night now.
But I was going to
only a couple weeks away from Breece Hall being the RB1 in Dynasty. That part is exciting, but you're going to have to make plays when you get them in this Jets offense that has 3 receivers and is now going to Breece Hall.
Right. Hall saw a big shift this week. I was going to mention it as we start talking about the Jets, but it's funny because I these are the things that we're always talking about, the changing sort of fantasy landscape as well. These are the things that are not, I mean, I feel like our listeners probably already are aware of because they don't go under the radar. But Hall very easily surpassed Michael Carter in snaps this week, ran more routes, had the bump in rushing volume that you talked about last week, that they had something like 8 rushing expected points combined through the first few weeks. And as we saw this Flacco to Wilson shift impact the passing volume, it was going to have a positive impact on the rushing volume. Hall runs really well, but also just the snap share shift, the route share shift, all of that was very positive for Hall. At the same time, I have a buddy who's in a casual league. He texted me this morning and he got offered Jamar Chase for his Breece Hall. So I'm like, okay, there's a lot of people out there that are talking about how Breece Hall is going to be the next superstar, because there's people out here offering Jamar Chase for him straight up already. If for some reason you're in a league where you don't have to use Jamar Chase to go trade for him and you could get him a little bit cheaper than that, I would say that Breece Hall is definitely someone to be buying and looks like he's going to be an absolute stud. That shift in the backfield where Carter has been leading was very exciting for Hall. Wilson, you mentioned, missed some time. A note on him, like he got up to 90% routes in this game, which was great because he hadn't had a game yet, I think over 75. Week 1 was pretty limited. Week 2 took a huge jump forward and had the big game, but what still wasn't all the way at a full route share. And I was real excited for week 3, but he had the rib injury, missed some time, and that ultimately limits his ability to play a full game. This was his first fully healthy full game. So it's interesting that you notice he was out on a red zone play, but I do one of the things I wrote up this week, Corey Davis did have the strongest game, but he was clearly third in routes. He was the one that was down in the 70% range. They had Elijah Moore, who's been running a lot of routes all year, and Garrett Wilson, both in the 90% plus range as their 2 guys. And it looks like going forward, the Jets are going to let the young guys sort of be their receivers. Hopefully, that Zach Wilson rapport develops as well that you mentioned he had.
And he and Elijah Moore seem like, they're a little bit more on the same page. Flacco was giving a ton of air yards to Moore, but I think that Wilson is going to give him more catchable passes.
Yeah. So the Jets look like they're headed in a direction where they're going to play their offense as these youth pieces. And obviously Michael Carter's a youth piece too, but they're going to play the guys that we liked in fantasy, which is exciting, or at least this week looked that way. Like it will be Hall as the lead and Carter as the secondary back. It will be Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson as the 2 main receivers, with Corey Davis as sort of the third. That's sort of the way that, ADP shook out and all that. It's just a question of, can Zach Wilson make this offense fun? And we have to be pretty skeptical because they were fun with Joe Flacco and now they're not. There they were for 1 year.
The last 10 minutes of the game were more promising. And again, with Breece Hall, just a situation where he should have been more expensive. And I understand there were reasons that he wasn't. And some of those manifested in the first 3 weeks. And they could still manifest going forward. But talking about ways in which you could use the dead zone to your advantage this year,
I argue
it's just that I have a huge exposure to Breece Hall, and it feels good after a week where it was positive. Every time a good week happens, it's tempting to feel like, okay, I was right. And when a bad week happens, you're like, let's let it play out.
Yeah, this is going to change. Yeah. But no, I argued with you about that, and we talked about where to get Hall, whether he was worth a 3rd-round pick, maybe worth a late 4th. We ended up getting him in the 5th in some of our last drafts, which was great. But my argument was that it wasn't like a Jonathan Taylor rookie situation where he'd take over the backfield by late year. It might be more like a Javonte Williams situation where he spent most of his rookie year in a committee because Michael Carter's there. This week looked a lot more like the Jonathan Taylor trajectory, and even earlier, right? Because Taylor took almost half of his rookie year or more to suddenly become the main guy, or he was the main guy right after Marlon Mack got hurt. He wasn't particularly effective, and then they kind of sat him down for a 3-week stretch and then turned it back over to him again. Hall, it looks like this is shocking to me, honestly. As early as we've seen because Carter's not playing bad either, but Hall looks so good that they are responding. He is our best running back. We need to play him, and that's fantastic to see. Great call on your part. Hats off.
Well, and it could be even better, too, because he's been much more involved as a receiver than Taylor was. And this game, one of the frustrating things, there were 3 different times when, if you go in and look at his target numbers and his actual receiving numbers, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. There were 3 passes where he either dropped the ball or Wilson put the ball in a location that was going to take a heroic grab, and he got close. Right? 3 balls that go off of his hands. When you add 3 more receptions, everybody in PPR knows that that's a big deal, but it's also something where you kind of expect them to get on the same page there. If we're another month down the line and they continue to miss on some of these short passing attempts, that would be pretty frustrating at that point.
Yeah. The other really frustrating thing this week we haven't mentioned yet, we talked a lot about the Trey Lance injury when it happened. I mean, it's kind of funny. The first big injury sort of makes you numb to other stuff, but the Javonte Williams one was a huge bummer. Subscribers over at Stealing Signals will know that I had him as the RB7 preseason, had him very, very high in a tier ahead of some guys like Najee Harris who was going well behind. I thought this isn't something we haven't talked about a lot, and I don't know if I've even written about it a lot, but I thought the start to the season was playing out really well for the potential like Javonte Williams RB1 overall season, where Taylor wasn't really hitting his ceiling. The Colts look like such a bad offense. McCaffrey is having a more normal year. No one else is really hitting. The veterans are not hitting. And yeah, the Broncos were off to a really slow start, but Javonte was playing good. He looked good again as like a talent-based play. Very similar to what we're talking about with Hall. The reason I bring him up, I mean, obviously it sucks for the player. It's like so frustrating. I got immediate questions about Dynasty. I'd be curious your thoughts on him in Dynasty, Sean. My commentary was, I saw Ryan McDowell show some Dynasty trades that have happened since the injury, and a couple of them included a first-round pick in 2023. I mean, he's out for the year. I think if you can get a first-round pick next year to trade him, you kind of have to, because he's got a long road back. You look at like where Dobbins is at now and where Cam Akers is at now. I think most people are asking about sort of more realistic trade packages, because I think it's probably pretty hard to get a 2023 first for him, knowing he's hurt through past that draft, right? We're not going to see him until we see those 2023 rookies on the field.
You're not going to be able to trade him for a 2023 rookie pick during rookie season next year. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. And now might be the time to trade him because of that. I'm kind of curious what his value would be to you. But the thing I wanted to say that's just sort of a bummer, and this is just another one of those things, it's like, doesn't even matter. It doesn't make a lot of sense to even talk about it, but he had not had a game over 65% snaps this year. He gets hurt on the first play of the second half. He played 45% in this game. He had played almost the entire first half until Melvin Gordon fumbled with 3 minutes and 30 seconds left in the second quarter, in the half. So Gordon wasn't mixing in the first quarter. That was Gordon's first touch of the game, 3 minutes and 30 seconds left in the half. This was a game where they actually went to Javonte for the first 3+ drives. They give Gordon that one touch. He fumbles. They return it for a touchdown. He sits down, doesn't play the rest of the half. Williams starts the second half, gets hurt on the very first play of the second half. And then as soon as he got hurt, they brought in Mike Boone. And Mike Boone ended up playing 2-1 snaps over Gordon. I do think going forward, for the people that are curious, our thoughts, I mean, they've already said Gordon's going to kind of be their guy. Gordon's going to be. I mean, he's the guy who has the longer track record. Mike Boone had some really bad drops late in this game, is not really what I think some people want him to be. He's in a potentially explosive change of pace back. Gordon's the 3-down potential, do everything back. And he's still that player, still played really well last year. Gordon is a guy that's going to go on to have a pretty strong season now. Boone is a very good waiver candidate, but I wouldn't expect him outplaying Gordon 2-1 in snaps to stick. But I do think it's really interesting that Gordon fumbles in this game, his 4th fumble of the year, and gets benched for it even after Williams goes out and basically just plays as the backup to the 3rd stringer. Javonte Williams plays a half and 1 snap, ended up with a 45% snap share. I mentioned he had a 65% as a high. He was well on his way to a 75% plus snap share in this game. Especially, even before the Gordon fumble, they were playing in, but especially considering the Gordon fumble and the way the team responded. I mean, Javonte was going to play the whole second half of this game. He was going to be their guy. I think he could have had a 90% snap share in this game. This would have been sort of that game. And if he has a really big game, it could have been the turning of the tide for him in this season. It's just a depressing, frustrating thing that I wanted to share. But the fact that he only plays a half and gets to a 45% snap share, it was the most they've leaned into him all year for that first half of this game. And almost certainly would have been the way they leaned into him for the second half, because Gordon, fumbled on his one opportunity in the first half. So just a frustration to not get to see, what he could have been able to do in that role in the rest of this game and potentially over the next few weeks, where it looked like he was really actually starting to take over the backfield.
Yeah, it's just such a bummer from a human perspective, and those things that you're outlining there. I mean, you can throw in the fact that he's been more involved as a receiver than I think was the most likely outcome for this year when you consider all of the receiving weapons that they have. If you add those receiving points in, then suddenly you're getting to that type of profile where you could have 18, 19 expected points a game. It hadn't been happening yet because of how poorly this offense as a whole was playing. But if you look at the talent level that Javonte Williams brings to the table, and it's been so well illustrated through all the different peripherals over his rookie season in the first several games, then you're looking at someone who could outperform by 4 points per game. And then you get up in that 22, 23 point per game scoring level where, exactly like you're saying, you start to threaten as the overall RB1 and a clear-cut league winner. Because one of the things that is probably going to happen is that the Broncos are little by little going to come together. Now, they've made a lot of poor decisions in the early going. Their coaching staff has looked overmatched. Russell Wilson has not looked like peak Russell Wilson by any stretch. And yet, you get a touchdown here early to Cortland Sutton. You get the touchdown to Jerry Jeudy. You get the big play to KJ Hamler. You have Greg Dulcich eventually coming on and perhaps giving some of that tight end receiving firepower. This team is just going to take longer than expected to become what everybody was excited about, but they still got a pretty good chance of being at least 80, 90% of that. And if you drop the 75% snap, 65% snap, 75% workload Javonte Williams down into that offense in week 8, week 9, week 10, you're talking about going out there every week feeling like you've got 20 points.
Yeah.
And so it is pretty frustrating.
I agree with you about the Broncos, though. And as we look forward, it's very promising for Gordon. It's funny, as you were describing what has happened with the Broncos so far, we are still so early. One of the things I used to describe the Kyle Pitts situation where, again, for anyone who really wants our in-depth thoughts on that, like, he's still earning volume on a per route basis incredibly well. It's mostly a team level thing, but the fact that they have thrown fewer passes per game than any team over a full season has since 2009. So far they're at 24.5 pass attempts per game. No team has been below 25 pass attempts per game since 2009. And then also the element where he's not running the full slate of reps for whatever reason. He's now in 2 weeks in a row here, and 60% of routes, of dropbacks he's running a route on. I called it a first percentile outcome for him in terms of we knew that they could be run heavy, but they are so limited on their passing, and they're not even running him on all of the passing routes that they do have, that he's ran 29 routes in the last 2 games combined. 29 routes is a low single game
because
for a player of
they were
his caliber.
so run heavy that they wanted their handful of passes to look like runs.
Yeah.
In which case they didn't want him out there because they wanted it to look like a run.
Yeah. And it's very ridiculous, but I call that a first percentile outcome to try to drive home this idea that, also when you throw in his efficiency, his catch rate right now is sub 50%. There's so many elements to the Pitts thing. Again, he's earning enough volume, but his fantasy points right now are literally, maybe they're not first percentile, but when you talk about coming into the year, especially if you told me that he was going to be at a 24% targets per out run and, a 76% weighted targets per out run when you throw the air yards in and how high his ADOT is, I would have told you like we were right about everything. That's what you want to see on a per route basis. It's right there with Mark Andrews.
Just take the W.
Yeah. Right there with Mark Andrews. But everything else is like this first percentile outcome. It's at least a 5th percentile. It's not even 10th. The Broncos, as you were talking about them, made me think of that same sort of thinking where, yes, everything's been wrong with Hackett. Yes, everything's been wrong with Wilson. Yes, everything looks terrible. But it's been like a first percentile outcome or a 5th percent. There's no, and the reason, again, I'm emphasizing this, there's no real way it can get worse. Yeah, our expectations should probably shift so that now maybe there is ways it can get worse. Like maybe going forward, we have a different idea of what the floor is for this offense and what the ceiling is.
Well, now they don't have
Javonte
Williams that the defense has to deal with.
What's that?
Now they don't have Javonte Williams that the defense has to account for.
It could get worse in some ways. We should shift our prior some, but overwhelmingly, any change from what we've seen is up for the Broncos, and it is for Pitts too. Like, I don't think he's going to keep running 60% of the routes. It's just ridiculous. I think they're going to keep throwing, 24.5 pass attempts per game. They're going to be low, but these next few games the Falcons have coming up, again, for anyone who cares about the Pitt stuff, or, I think most people are either loving that he looks like a bust and think we're just biased, or they're with us and they're hunkered down and they're going to die on this hill. But they play the Buccaneers, 49ers, and Bengals the next 3 weeks, and in all likelihood, they're going to have to pass more. They're not going to be able to run as much as they want to against those types of teams. Maybe not in all 3 games, but certainly over that stretch. Anyway, the only room forward for the Pitt stuff is up. The only room forward for the Broncos offense, similarly, is up. You're not going to see anything get worse. Or too much worse.
Just to look a little bit more at the running back situation going forward for people who are trying to figure out how to play it now, you mentioned just how poorly Gordon was playing, and he has been a disappointment. They reacted to that with the Mike Boone incorporation in week 4. It's hard to see him being a big part of it. They've already kind of said that he probably won't be. He did have the egregious drop at the end, which again, that kind of thing happens. But when it happens in such a high-profile moment, it doesn't help you get more snaps, unfortunately.
Right. Latavius Murray. He dropped a little dump off, and he dropped the one down the field. I think you're probably talking about the one that was a little more down the field, but it was 2 in a row right on his hands. And that just puts even more of a spotlight on the fact that you're not going to probably get more work. It just looked really bad. Yeah,
it's tough. And they signed Latavius Murray. He's someone who did have his moments in that London game. He is someone who has been at 9% and 7% evasion rate the last 2 seasons. That is the kind of thing that lands you on a team's practice squad. It is the kind of running dynamic that makes it so you can't beat out Devontae Freeman when you're put in a pretty good situation with the Baltimore Ravens.
He looked bad with the Ravens last year. The Ravens made Freeman look good, and Freeman's not on the team right now, and he looked bad.
Yeah. He still has a little bit more burst straight ahead than even some other runners. And so to an extent, you could argue he's even outperformed those evasion numbers slightly. But Gordon, even though he's not playing well, still at a 16% evasion rate this year. One of the reasons he was on the 0 RB watch list, or the 0 RB candidates countdown going into the year, because he had some standalone value, which did materialize early, and because in this scenario, he would be a potential league winner for you. Now, I think that some of the elements of that thesis actually are not playing out that well, and that the Broncos don't look like a dynamic offense, and he doesn't look as good. And so it's a frustrating deal. I wish that he hadn't been on the countdown. I wish that this hadn't happened. Those 2 things obviously are not connected, but sometimes I go into 0% on some of the backups to players where I just can't even imagine the starter getting hurt. And even though it may play out here, I wish I were at 0 on Melvin Gordon. But he is a guy that,
speaking of him being on the countdown, I know this is in no way what you are the last person, but that would ever. I just have to tell you, I got a tweet that said, my reaction when Shawn spoke this into existence a week or 2 ago. It's the gif from Ricky Bobby. Don't you put that evil on me. Because you did. I think you've mentioned before, even the young players can get hurt. And I think you mentioned it on Javonte. And so now your Oracle predictive nature has now apparently cursed Javonte Williams, and everyone's blaming you.
This is the worst. I take responsibility. I apologize. No, we hope that it ends up being a clean recovery for him. We are seeing very quick and full recoveries from some players. We're seeing a little bit longer road for others. You do have to be very conservative in Dynasty. It's a tough road back. And it's not just, are you going to get that production later, but you've now lost. One of the things at the running back position is just the peak is so early. And these guys who are hurt, the Akers, the Dobbins, you lost the Travis Etienne, right? You've lost a key season at your peak. And Etienne's frustrating start to the year is going a little bit under the radar here. It's tough to come back and have that same value. When you're looking at the value of Javonte Williams in the first place in Dynasty, so much of it was 2022. Right? That you're going to have a great year this year, that you're going to have this huge trade value after the year. Yeah, I mean, I think that every once in a while, you even get people who think that because of zero RB that we are in favor of running back injuries or rooting for running back injuries. It's a part of it, but we're rooting in the exact opposite direction. And when these guys get hurt, I mean, I hate it. I hate it. And
yeah,
it really puts a damper on the whole Sunday.
Yeah, it put a damper on the whole Sunday. It sucks for football because it would have been. I mean, this is a potentially, like I said, like he could have had a top 5 season. This is a potentially great storyline for the 2022 season that we'll never get to see if it could have materialized, or in the scenarios where it does materialize, we don't get to see. It's just gone. Melvin Gordon's not going to be that good. Now we get to see a 29-year-old back have some fantasy value and do the best that he can, but he's not. Javonte Williams had a talent-based argument to be what Saquon Barkley has been, which was a talent-based thing, like that he can just be so good that he's putting up so much fantasy points. He's creating big plays, exciting plays. It's fun to watch the Giants, who otherwise, I'm knocking on wood, but if something were to happen to Saquon Barkley again this year, like why would we watch the Giants? We'd have no reason to. Like you just mentioned, the only reason you were paying any attention to that Bears-Giants game was you do like to check in on Saquon Barkley. I mean, you literally would have had no reason to watch that game. None of us would have if Saquon Barkley wasn't playing in it. We want the good players out there playing. I mean, this is horrible for us as fans, but it's obviously horrible for Javonte first and foremost. I mean, it just sucks. It's another multi-ligament injury. Like we're dealing with Dobbins, kind of slow comeback. Like this is going to be a thing that it's not only that he loses 2022, it's that in 2023, we can't feel as good about him physically as we, even going into the year as we otherwise would have, because he didn't just tear his ACL. I think he tore his LCL and tore his MCL too, maybe. I mean, they're talking about there's some type of corner that is a part of the knee that also is damaged or torn, or I didn't, I don't understand the mechanics of the knee necessarily, but is a multiple ligament injury. It's another one like Dobbins that is going to be a long road back from. We really hope to see him play at a really high level, but it's one of those things where 2023 is not going to be a clean year for him. And so you're hoping, you talk about his age, he's only 22 years old. That's why we liked him so much as a 21-year-old rookie last year and liked him going into this year. He's so young. But age 23 season next year, probably a little bit of a rehab year. You hope to see him get back and be explosive. But you're really talking about, age 24 and on now. Can he be the player that he otherwise would have been without this injury? And at that point, you are already talking about sort of the back end of a running back's career. I mean, 24 is early to be saying back end, but he's got a couple more years there. But at a certain point, you get to 26, 27, you're talking about, we're usually fading running backs at that point. And so it really does change the whole shape of his career. It's not just 2022. It's, can he be the same player after 2022? And does he have enough time, frankly, to now work back and have multiple years of greatness? There's this potential that he has one maybe fantastic year in the future, but it looks a lot less likely now that we see a memorable running back career of multiple years of greatness when you have this type of injury at this point in a player's career.
Yeah, and maybe if there's a silver lining there, it's that we did get 2 touchdowns from J.K. Dobbins on Sunday. It's a receiving touchdown, a rushing touchdown, had another goal line opportunity where it wasn't blocked up pretty well, and he did not make a Superman type of play, avoiding the guy who was right there in his face as he took the ball. Not a lot of highlight runs or wow plays from him yet, but things moving in a positive direction there. That's what we're hoping for Javonte Williams, that maybe he can be at this time next year back into the spot that Dobbins is today. And for Dobbins, obviously, we hope that this is a step that he can build on. Frustrating situation there with Justice Hill. Just cannot stay healthy, pulls a hamstring on a play where he had broken into the open. The Ravens now are probably going to have, at least in the short term, less dynamic backups, which when they're used, that can hurt the offense. That can be bad for Justice Hill, can be bad for Lamar Jackson, can be bad for everybody. But the big thing here, we're rooting for Javonte Williams. We're rooting for J.K. Dobbins as he continues his comeback. And Ben, we will have more for the listeners in the next episode of Stealing Bananas, but that should do it for us on this one. As always, I'm Shawn Siegele. You can follow me That was a weird way to start it, Ben. You can't follow me. You can follow Ben Gretch, who is my co-host at Yards Per Gretch. You can sign up for Stealing Signals. You can sign up for Stealing Lines. We mentioned Ben this week, 6-1-1. We know that Dalton Cates is also bringing great intel to that project. We'd love to have you guys join us over at RotoViz. You can use coupon code RVRadio2022 at checkout to get 10% off of your 1-year subscription. We've had a number of new writers debut recently. They've been doing a lot of cool stuff. Blair Andrews, Dave Caven. I mentioned it several times on our final episode last week, Ben. We talked about a lot of the cool stuff that Dave has in new tools up at RotoViz. Just incredible depth to the stats available there. We'd love to have you guys leave us a rating and review, sign up for the feed. All of those things help us with the algorithm. And again, we love you guys so much. We'll talk to you soon.